Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our analysis of the Russia-Ukrainian war, and what I wanted to do in this episode is talk about the amount of money the United States, in both dollars and then actual military aid and non-military aid, has been handed over to Ukraine. And the reason I'm looking at this is, obviously, as an American citizen, I'm concerned. I'm concerned where this money is going. I'm concerned how this money is being spent. But first, let's look at just how much money has been handed over to the Ukrainians, both, again, not just dollars, a pile of cash, but military and non-military aid. And this is just the United States. So at the start of the war between Russia and Ukraine, the defense budget of the Russian Federation was about 60 billion US dollars. I believe the United Kingdom spends about 50 billion, if I'm not mistaken, in defense spending, $50 billion. The U.S. has handed over both in military and again, the vast majority of what we have given the Ukrainians has been military aid. Huge amounts. $54 billion. $54 billion. And this Biden administration is possibly looking at handing over in excess of another $30 billion before this conflict is even over with. $50 billion. And then you look at Ukraine and you have to ask yourself, is Ukraine of such a strategic importance that it is worth handing over $50 billion in just U.S. aid to the Ukrainians? And then at the same time, again, you have to look at where this money is going. We just had an election here in the United States. I think a lot of persons are looking at how much money the Democrats have spent during the election process. We look at that money that has been handed over to the Ukrainians. We know the relationship that existed between certain Ukrainian companies and Hunter Biden. We know about the Bitcoin fiasco and the collapse of that Bitcoin company with Freed. He contributed millions and millions. I believe he was the second largest donor to the Democratic Party. So I imagine we will eventually find out how this money was used. If it's possible that some of this money made its way back to Democrat coffers, would not surprise me at all. And then again, we look at Ukraine and we ask ourselves, is it worth that much money? Could we have spent that money in other areas of the world that would have been more helpful to the United States, to the strategic position of the United States. Look, Taiwan is much more of an imperative that we, the United States, make sure that Taiwan continues to be a fully independent nation state. It produces most of the advanced microprocessors, semiconductors, that the world uses. I've talked about this before. A Chinese attack on Taiwan that would maybe not be an actual amphibious invasion to seize control of the island, but a blockade would do just as much harm to both the U.S. and world economies than an actual invasion. Could the United States have taken some of that money that it has given to the Ukrainians and thus eliminated the threat posed by the People's Republic of China to Taiwan? What if we had handed over just $20 billion to Taiwan? What if we had given many of those HIMARS, harpoons, javelins that the Ukrainians received and put them in the hands of Taiwan? Taiwan is much more of a transparent democracy than what you get in Ukraine. The mainstream media has done a phenomenal job of portraying the Ukrainians, Zelensky, quite possibly as something it is not. Now, I'm not saying that Russia has the right to march into Ukraine and take it over. I'm not so sure, even without the military aid that has been given to Ukraine, and the amount that it has been given, that we would see that occur. All of Ukraine. Eventually, this war will end. Now, who will win, who will lose, difficult to say. But these two nation states, Russia and Ukraine, will still be present. They will still be there. And the Ukrainians are going to have to deal with Russia. They're going to have to deal with Belarus. Russia is going to have to deal with Ukraine. And again, vice versa. We know now, based on what we've seen from a military aspect, that a military invasion by the Russian Federation into Western Europe, Poland, Romania, is simply not militarily feasible for the Russian Federation. They do not, at this point right now, have the military capacity to threaten to take over Poland. So the idea that the United States is preventing the Russians from marching into Western Europe next is a farce. If you hear that on the street, if you hear a person say, well, we're stopping the Russians in Ukraine, where they then don't take Western Europe, and they draw that 1939 analogy with Nazi Germany. Completely different scenario. Completely different. It's not the same thing. Now, could the Russians march into Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, yeah, I do believe they could. And at the same time, I believe it was a mistake by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to accept the Baltic states into that alliance. At the same time, as we use that analogy, we know now that without a doubt, the NATO alliance would have been able to stop a Russian move towards Poland. Without a doubt. Could the Russians do a lot of damage to Western Europe with its ballistic missiles, the deployment of its nuclear attack submarines? Yeah, absolutely. But again, the risk now for Russia to launch such an operation, at least now, is glaringly apparent that it would probably, well, not probably, it would not be successful. The Russians, after this conflict with Ukraine, are going to really have to go back to the drawing board and reassess itself, especially in its military capacity. Outside of a total national mobilization effort. Now, we're seeing signs of that now, obviously. We're seeing new weapon systems being deployed by the Russians. Being deployed in this conflict that may not have been used early in the conflict, but we're starting to see them now. In all probability, the Russians, not in all probability, it's going to be an absolute must for the Russians to take a step back, look at its Air Force. In the modern era, in 2022, 2023, 2024, and forward into the 2030s, you have to have air dominance. You have to have air superiority. You have to have that technology if you are going to be militarily successful. The Russians going into this, especially, again, the Air Force, has been abysmal. I mean, a 50% ready rate for many of its aircraft. Reports that some of its pilots had anywhere between just above 9 hours of flight time in a year. And these are mistakes the Russians are going to have to go back and look at and correct. But again, $50 billion. Look at the defense budgets of nations around the world. Pakistan, with a 550,000 man ground force, something like 700,000 men in its military, has about a $10 billion defense budget. And we're giving the Ukrainians $50 billion. And yes, that's part of the reason, in all probability, why we're seeing the Russians not being as successful as many analysts had probably thought going into this. I mean, if you remember at the onset of the conflict, there was talk that the Russians would seize Kiev in 72 hours. What a joke. What a complete fiasco in terms of predicting that. It's just nuts. But based on what's going on the ground right now, the amount of money that has been given to the Ukrainians, the amount of real-time intelligence aid the United States has handed over and continues to hand over to the Ukrainians to give them situational awareness on Russian troop deployments, the vectoring of aircraft, of inbound Russian aircraft into Ukraine. But is it worth it? What's the end game? Man, I don't think anybody can answer that. I mean, the Ukraine is becoming this black hole, the black monetary hole of indefinite spending, and in all probability that spending is going elsewhere at the same time. Hopefully, with the Republicans taking control of Congress, we will have proper oversight into what's happening. Because I, for one, have concerns. And I'm looking at the best interest of the United States. Look, if Russia took control of Ukraine today, all of it, which is incredibly unlikely, how does that hurt the United States? Again, based on what we've seen, again, from a military perspective, the military capability of the Russian military, it is not a threat to Western Europe. China is a threat. It is a directional threat. The Chinese military is going to look a lot different in 2030 than it does now. And it is a very robust and capable force, much more capable, much more powerful than the Russian military. The Chinese spend a lot more money on their military than the Russians do. The production capacity of the Chinese is far more advanced, both in quality and quantity, than what we're seeing from Russia. So it's very concerning where this goes, and could this money that has been handed over to the Ukrainians been better served helping out Taiwan? Could the United States have paid more attention to what is happening in East Africa? You have genocide occurring. The loss of human life in East Africa is greater than what we are seeing, or was greater than what we're seeing now in Ukraine. Ethnic cleansing. Again, what's happening in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, has much more of an odor of a civil war. These two people are very, very close. Most Ukrainians speak Russian as their first language. I was in around a fairly large group of people, and we were talking about the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. And most people in that room believed that most Ukrainians spoke most people in Ukraine spoke the Ukrainian language. The president of Ukraine, Zelensky, barely speaks Ukrainian. But the general public doesn't know that. They know what kind of eyeshadow Kim Kardashian is wearing. They know what kind of eyeshadow Bruce Jenner is wearing. But they don't know a damn thing about world events. It's dumbing down of the population. Anyway, we will continue to see this administration just open up the wallet and hand out cash to the Ukrainians. In perpetuity. Maybe now that the Congress, again, things are changing there on that front. And maybe things will slow down a bit. Difficult to say at this point. But again, just astronomical as I look at these numbers and I look at the amount of wealth and treasure that has been handed over to the Ukrainians. Just unbelievable. Just unbelievable. And what is it going to get us? Probably nothing. Have a good day.